Who shall find a valiant woman? Far and from the utmost coast is the price of her. Boys, this is the beginning of the epistle for the Mass of St. Anne. Again, this whole epistle sings the praise of a valiant woman. Now, I didn't think that was too fitting for us since we are having our boys' camp, which only happens once a year, so I hope to make it a little more exciting. Now, the story I will tell you does involve a valiant woman. We will follow a priest, a missionary, in his journey in meeting with this woman. So Father John Gerard, the name of the priest, he was a missionary in England during the persecutions. He studied abroad and he was ordained a priest, and then he requested and was given permission to go into England. So he boarded a ship with a group of other priests, missionaries, and they set out for England. They landed at night, secretly on a coast, and they departed their ship with all of their goods, and after spending one night together, they agreed it would be most prudent that they go their separate ways. So if they were caught, at least perhaps one of them would make his way to the missions. Because at this time, remember, in England, the country had already been under persecution for many years. At this point, it was very common that there were spies and traitors, even people you think you can rely upon turning you in because they would be rewarded very handsomely by the officials, by the government officials. And so it was you could become wealthy by betraying Catholics, especially priests. So there were many spies, many dishonest men lurking about. And they knew that there were missionaries coming in at all times. Now, Father John Gerard, he went his own way. He stayed along the coast, and he found some fishermen in a nearby port, and he befriended these fishermen. It seems he had some past, at least some experience as a fisherman himself and as a hunter. He had some common ground, and he could relate with these men. At this point in his life, he had already given up these things, and he had no real care for them anymore. But they did come in use, because he was able, by his experience, his knowledge of these common things, befriend these men. He became fast friends, in fact. He showed great enthusiasm in their trade, and in the end, he asked them if he could work with them for some days. And in payment, they would just take him where he desired to go. In this way, he could travel very safely under the guise of a fisherman, of a crude fisherman. And they agreed. They took him willingly because he had shared their interest so well. Well, they traveled for some days in this way, and Father Gerard, he has actually written an account of all of these things with his own pen, and he relates that it was difficult to spend those days with these men because they were so crude and vulgar and not at all what he was now accustomed to, that is, living with priests and holy men. Now, he would not refuse them his company altogether. He tried to influence them for the better. And by the end of his journey, he does tell us that he had quite success in this, that he was able to make them say bad words less, and especially not to blaspheme God. He taught them mostly by his example. He would pray and be very respectful to the name of God, that he taught them slowly over the course of a week to have more reverence for God and to not speak so crudely. In any case, he finally reached his destination, which was much farther north, in the country, and there he embarked for his mission. His mission was that of, it was a very large house owned by a valiant woman. She was a very noble and very wealthy lady, a Catholic lady. It seems that she had been spared, at least in her area, the greater rigors of the law. She was able to get by paying fines, and she was so wealthy that she could still keep her estate. She had a very large mansion, and Father Gerard, he took up his abode there, and he started to say Mass and to hear confessions and reconcile heretics to the church. And he had a lot of success in doing this because the Catholics, they had a very intricate system of communicating without letting officials know. Now, this could not protect them always because, again, there were some traitors in their very midst. On one occasion in this house, Father Gerard, well, he almost was taken prisoner because one of the servants, it was a very large house, there were many servants, one of the servants called the police in. Now, this servant worked on a lower floor, not where the chapel was, and was not so highly looked upon by the mistress. She trusted him, but she would not actually reveal to him that she had a priest because this servant was not a professed Catholic. In any case, servants were like family in these times, and so you would not necessarily suspect, just because one of your servants is not a Catholic, that they will betray you in this way. In any case, the police showed up one day. They were saying Mass, and so Father had to stop his Mass, take off his vestments very quickly, and they had a cleverly contrived secret hiding place. They often did this in these times, in the house. This house had two hiding places. One of them was in the dining room, Father tells us, and then one of them was actually in the chapel room. Now, when the police arrived, they started banging on the door. The servants kept the door shut and kept the police at bay, telling them the mistress would come soon to let them in. In the meantime, on the upper floor, where Father was saying Mass, they were packing away all of his goods so to leave no evidence that he was staying there. And he tells us that he wanted to stay in the hiding place that was in the dining room. It was farther from the chapel room, which was a very suspicious place, and he was sure they would look there more than anywhere else, and he didn't want to be close to that room. But even furthermore, there was, in the dining room hiding place, a provision of food and some drink, in case he had to stay there for many days. However, the mistress of the house, she prevailed upon him to stay in the other hiding place. She thought, for some reason, he did not really understand, she really insisted he stay in this other hiding place near the chapel. So she prevailed upon him. He did as she wished, and all of his goods were packed into this little hiding place under the fireplace in that room. And they managed to do this before the police finally arrived to the door. They were let in, and they knew, because of this servant, that there was a priest in that house. And so they weren't going to stop until they found him. They locked up the mistress and all of her friends into a separate room far off, and they started to knock on all of the walls. They started to measure the walls to see if there was anything that was not accounted for, some compartments that they could break into. Now, the father had nothing to eat but a little biscuit that day. He would be in that room, that little compartment of the fireplace, for 4 days without anything to eat or drink, and he tells us he had to sit, or rather stay standing the whole time, because it was such a small compartment. It was by the providence of God he was not taken, because he tells us that after 2 days straight of peeling plaster and breaking down different closets and so forth, they actually did find the dining room compartment, that little hiding place he would have gone to. They found it empty, of course, and so they became a bit discouraged. One night, somebody lit the fire in the fireplace above his head, and he thought he was going to be taken in now because it was not a real fireplace. It was not meant to actually burn fire. So when they started the fire, it burned a hole in the floor because the brick was right on top of wood. So the wood burned under the brick, and it left a big hole there. And he tells us it was at night that the men, he could hear them. They were right above him now, and they said, well, this is a curious thing. What kind of fireplace is this? And they said nothing more about it. And the next day, they continued their search, but no one even looked in that room again. And he tells us that they could have, if they had stepped by the fireplace, they could have seen him standing there if they were close. People were above the fireplace knocking on the chimney all around him, but they never found him. And in the end, they all left. The servant came back, the traitor, and was alone with the mistress. They had been freed because they found no priest. So the mistress, the faithful mistress, and the traitor were there, and the people had gone so far away that the traitor, not willing to expose himself to the mistress, he kept silent, and the priest was called back out. But what's really edifying in this story is the mistress herself. She fasted for that whole period as well. She would not eat, knowing that Father was without food too. She did this to see how long he could possibly survive in those conditions, but also to invoke the mercy of God that he be freed. And her prayer was heard. A couple lessons we can draw from this story. Well, the first, children, boys, is you see in this how Father first influenced those fishermen, how he was able to influence them. It's something I like to call condescension. You see, these men were very rude and crude, and they did not have very good habits. And Father was quite the opposite. He was a very well-trained priest, but he accommodated himself to these men as much as he could. He would try to talk about the things they liked to talk about. And he knew a little bit and was able to do that very well. And in that way, they looked at him as one of their own, as a friend. And so they would listen to him. He had an ear, and he was able to influence them for good. That is something that you will find throughout life, especially in days like this. When you meet different people, you have to sometimes give up your own interest in order to befriend others. And then furthermore, you see Father Gerard giving up his own judgment, preferring that of this mistress. Many times in life we can do that. We're not always obliged to. We have certain freedom. We should stand for some things, of course, especially those things that we are taught by our faith and our parents are very insistent upon. Certain principles, things you should do and should not do. You should stand for those. But there are many things, especially you can find today, I assure you, as we continue our boys' camp, different of things, topics of conversation, whether it be the choice of game, so many things that come up in our daily lives. We can stand for them for our own sake, but there's really no reason to stand for them. And to give them up, our own likes, our own opinions, for the sake of others, is always a much higher act of virtue, which is rewarded by God. In this case, Father Gerard was rewarded by being set free, spared from the imprisonment and torture of his enemies by listening to this woman, this valiant woman. Please say a prayer to St. Anne the valiant woman we celebrate today for that grace, that you can today try to practice some of these different virtues. May God bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.